Hello, everyone, and welcome to Neuroscience for Numpties. I'm your host, Joe, and I hope you're all having a wonderful day. Today, I am covering a brainwave-based lie detection article by the Rosenfeld lab. Now, Peter Rosenfeld is considered to be the world's leading expert on brainwave-based lie detection, so I'm very excited to introduce this paper to you guys. This is one of, but not the first, paper that Peter Rosenfeld published on brainwave-based lie detection. Now, Peter Rosenfeld was introduced to the P300 around, I think, the late 80s or mid 80s, and the more he learned about it, the P300, by the way, is a signal from the brain. I did cover that in a previous episode, but I should cover or remind you guys that the P300 is a signal from the brain. And as Peter Rosenfeld was learning about the P300, he was thinking to himself, gee, this brain signal kind of seems like it would make for a good lie detector, good polygraph. And so he went to the world's leading expert on P300 at the time, Manny Danchin. And they sat down together and they talked it over. And at the end of the conversation, Manny Danchin said, I think this could work. And both their labs went their separate ways, and surprise, surprise, they both came out with their own version of a brainwave-based polygraph. And I covered the Farwell and Danchin version of that polygraph 2 episodes ago. And now in this episode, I'll be covering the Rosenfeld version. So that's what we're in for today. Let me put the laser pointer on. And just a couple of housekeeping points to start off with before we jump into the paper. I hope you guys have noticed I've sort of streamlined the episodes a little bit. It's a bit neater. You can't see the background or my desktop in the background. And we won't be scrolling through the paper page by page like I did in a previous episode. I've just put the highlights in the video, and I think that's going to make things a lot more polished and just, simpler and more professional. I've also decided to sort of make a quality of life improvement to these publication episodes. When I'm covering the publication, I'm just going to focus on 3 questions. Basically, what did the authors do? What were the results? And then why should we, the general public, care? And that's the format of the episode. So I hope you guys like this new format, and let us dive right into it. Okay. So here's the paper I'll be covering in ERP-based, that's brainwaves, event-related potential, ERP-based control question lie detector analog. Now, the control question test is actually a very common interrogation protocol that is used in the real world. It's used by law enforcement all the time, so it made sense to kind of start off with the control question test. I'll get a little bit more into detail about what that is later, but the gist is that you have sort of a crime-relevant question that you ask the suspect, and then you have this control question that you suspect that they're actually innocent of, and you compare how they react to the crime question versus the control question. So that's the basic idea. In this paper, they actually covered a whole bunch of different algorithms for discriminating. I think maybe a better word would be diagnosing suspects as either guilty or innocent. And that comes as no surprise. They use all these fancy algorithms in the paper because they have this statistician on the paper. So the publication is very technical, and I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty on that. I'm just going to cover the high level of the paper, which, by the way, is available for free in the description below if you are interested. Okay, so let's start off with what did they do? Well, at the highest level, what the authors wanted to do, they're asking the question, can a brainwave-based polygraph catch real criminals? Now, you might remember if you watched episode 3, where I covered Farwell and Danchin, the 1991 paper, that the Farwell and Danchin paper used college students, and these college students were instructed to pretend that they were these spies for some foreign intelligence agency, and they were supposed to pass off these super secret plans to a sleeper agent who was waiting for them on campus somewhere. And it was this crazy, stupid, elaborate spy espionage situation, but it was all fake, right? So the Rosenfeld lab thought, well, maybe what we should be doing, it's great that, this brainwave-based polygraph can catch college students who are pretending to be criminals, but why don't we actually test the polygraph on real criminals? Now, the catch is that it's actually really, really difficult for researchers to get access to study prisoners. That's how you would get access to real criminals. But they're a highly protected population, and scientists just have a heck of a time trying to get access to study them. So the Rosenfeld lab actually came up with this neat little workaround. What they did was that they basically compiled a list of a lot of common crimes that college students might commit. So this would be like smoking pot monthly. That's weed was illegal back then. So and maybe still is in Illinois. I'm actually not sure. You could steal a bicycle, cheat during a test, not illegal, but that would get you in trouble with the university. Use a fake doctor's note to get out of a class, fail a course, plagiarize a paper. You know, you get it. These are a variety of crimes that college students can commit. Now, going back to the control question test, basically what you do is you say, we think you did blank, like smoke weed, but you might have also done blank. So use a false ID to buy beer or something like that. Both of those things would be illegal in Illinois. And what they're doing is that the first question they're asking you here is one that they actually suspect you're guilty of. So they would think that you do smoke weed. They're trying to confirm that in the interrogation. And then they're going to compare how you respond to that question and compare how you respond to this question, the second question, which they actually think you're innocent of. They would have a pretty good idea that you don't actually own a false ID or you've never used one before. And then the idea is they're comparing how you respond to being accused of a crime you did commit versus being accused of a crime you didn't commit. Okay, but then the question is, how do you know what crimes that someone's guilty of and which crimes that they're not guilty of? In the real world, you could never know that. You just have to make your best guess. And, that's kind of problematic. But for scientists, we do actually need to know the ground truth, because else how would we know if the brainwave-based polygraph was working or not? So again, the Rosenfeld lab actually came up with a very neat solution to this problem. What they did was that they got the participants alone in a room, and they said, don't worry, you're in perfect confidence. Just respond truthfully to which of these crimes you committed, if any, but nobody will know. Nobody will ever know that you committed these crimes, which is true. They didn't, if the student had committed a crime, then they didn't report it to the university or the police or anything like that. But they were being a little dishonest. The deception researchers were actually being the deceivers in this situation, because they had a camera that was a covert camera that was secretly recording their responses to the survey. And that's how the Rosenfeld lab knew which crimes that their participants committed and which ones they didn't. That way they got the ground truth, and then they could know how well their brainwave-based polygraph was working. Okay. So after getting those responses, they hooked the participants up to an electroencephalograph. I covered what that is in a previous episode, in case you're interested. And then they recorded their brainwaves and how their brains responded to each of the crimes that they were being accused of. So what were the results? Well, here's a table. I'm going to minimize my video a little bit if I can. Here's a table that will make your head hurt. It makes my head hurt. This is where the statistics come in. Basically, they had a bunch of different algorithms listed here, and these are the results of the algorithms. I'm not going to go into detail about what those actually mean. All that we're going to do is focus on this column right here, which is how each participant was diagnosed. These are the participants, G for guilty and I for innocent, and then they're diagnosed as either guilty or innocent. Okay. Now I've actually tabulated the results right here, so we don't need to pay attention to that table anymore. Okay, now they had 13 guilty participants and 15 innocent, and after all of their fancy statistics and diagnostic materials, they diagnosed 12 out of the 13 guilty participants as guilty, so that's 92% accurate, and they diagnosed 13 out of 15 of the innocent participants as innocent, that's 87%. So these accuracy rates are actually pretty good, very comparable to the Farwell and Donjan paper as well. So basically, the brainwave-based polygraph is working really well, right? There is one caveat that I wanted to mention, though. You might notice that 2 of the innocent participants were actually labeled as guilty. They were misdiagnosed as guilty. And that's a little problematic because at best, you could be wasting the investigators' time that they're investigating 2 people who aren't actually guilty. And at worst, you could be sending 2 innocent people to jail. So that's, you could consider that to be a big problem. And that's actually one of the flaws of the control question test, which is why scientists actually developed a new test called the concealed information test that is much more sensitive to that fact. They don't want to send innocent people to jail. That's pretty much the worst thing that you can do. According to scientists, believe that sending an innocent person to jail is about the worst thing you can do. Intelligence agencies like the CIA might actually disagree. And, you might think that that doesn't sound ethical, but then when you consider the fact that if they sacrifice, well, generally there's a trade-off. If you, I'll put it this way, the easier it is to pass the test, then you're going to convict less innocent people, but you're also going to let more guilty people go, and that's problematic. So the CIA, for example, definitely wouldn't want to let a guilty person go because they could be a terrorist and they could blow up a building and kill thousands of people. So they actually want to catch guilty people at all costs, even if it means that an innocent person goes to jail. So, and it's this really complex ethical conundrum, and it kind of depends on what you value or where your priorities are. So scientists tend to prefer to avoid sending innocent people to jail at all costs. And in the real world, however, they tend to prefer catching the guilty person at all costs. So it's just interesting that scientists and working professionals actually have different priorities. Okay, but bottom line, why should we care about any of this? Well, the experiment did a couple things. First of all, it proved that the brainwave-based polygraph actually works, right? This is the second time that I've covered with you guys have demonstrated that a brainwave-based polygraph works. And this was about, I think, the 4th publication in the literature at the time, because there were actually 2 experiments that were published in the 80s, also by the Rosenfeld lab, by the way. And the second thing is that this brainwave-based polygraph actually caught real criminals, which is really, really cool. No, they weren't murderers, but these were actual crimes, or in some cases, and in other cases like cheating on a test or plagiarizing, that would get you in trouble with the university. And so either way, these were things that these students didn't want the authority figures in their life to find out about, right? So they were incentivized to hide that, and they didn't want people to know that they had done these things. And don't worry, the students were never prosecuted for any of that. If they had found that they had cheated on a test or something, it was never reported to the university. So these students never got in trouble because their identities were protected. Their privacy was protected. So now this brings up a really fascinating point, the results of this brainwave-based polygraph. Basically, we know now that measuring the electricity in the brain, which is an objective measure, objective scientific measure, you can find objectively that the brain knows which crimes you committed and which ones you didn't. And that is kind of funny because obviously you know which crimes you committed and which ones you didn't, but it's just really fascinating that an outside observer, so to speak, could look into your brain and look at the electricity in your brain and also know which crimes that you committed and which ones you didn't. And that kind of leads to a lot of interesting questions, because obviously you would think that your brain knows just as much as you do, right? And so that opens up the door to an interesting question, like if you plan to commit a crime but you haven't committed it yet, would that plan be somewhere in your brain? I mean, this is something that you know, so shouldn't your brain know it too? And if your brain knows it, then doesn't that mean that we could look into your brain and find that out for ourselves as scientists? So this is kind of like if you ever saw the movie Minority Report with Tom Cruise, the whole pre-crime dilemma. Could you stop a crime before it starts just by looking in someone's brain? And as it turns out, scientists actually have studied this, and they do have a brainwave-based pre-crime protocol. And I'm going to talk about that in the next episode. So I'm going to end it here on that cliffhanger. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope you appreciated the new format. And again, thank you for watching the episode. I really appreciate it. And I will see you guys again soon. So bye for now.